never believed in any of that cryptid nonsense until what happened in the forests of Northern California back in 1993. Even now, 30 years later, I still wake up some nights hearing that sound, like a freight train made of muscle and fury tearing through the woods. What I'm about to tell you isn't some campfire story or internet hoax. This really happened, and the only reason I'm finally talking about it is because I figure enough time has passed that maybe nobody cares anymore. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I'm getting old and tired of carrying this around. It started in late September of 1993, when our logging crew got hired for what seemed like a dream job. The company, I won't say which one, but they were big enough to have lawyers in 3 states, wanted us to clear a section of old-growth forest about 60 miles northeast of Eureka. The pay was almost double what we usually made, which should have been our first red flag. When someone pays you twice what a job is worth, there's usually a reason. The foreman, a grizzled guy we called the Old Man because of his size and temperament, gathered our crew of 12 men around his pickup truck that first morning. He spread out a topographical map on the hood and pointed to a section marked in red pencil. The area was massive, probably close to 800 acres of virgin timber that had somehow escaped the logging boom of the early 1900s. Most of it was Douglas fir and redwood, some of the trees easily over 200 feet tall and older than the United States itself. The Old Man told us we had 6 weeks to clear the designated area, which was aggressive but doable with our equipment. We had 2 massive feller bunchers, a couple of skidders, and a loader that could lift logs the size of school buses. The company had even provided us with a temporary camp setup, 3 trailers for sleeping, a mess hall, and a maintenance shed. Everything was already in place when we arrived, like they had been planning this operation for months. The weird thing was the location. We were deep in national forest land, but somehow this company had gotten permits to log in an area that was supposedly protected. When one of the younger guys asked about it, the Old Man just shrugged and said the paperwork was above his pay grade. He'd seen stranger things in 20 years of logging, and as long as the checks cleared, he wasn't asking questions. Our crew was a mix of experienced loggers and a few newer guys who needed the work. We were all hardworking men who'd spent our lives in the woods, comfortable with the isolation and the dangerous work that comes with bringing down giants. The first week went exactly as planned. We set up our operation in a clearing about half a mile from the tree line and started working our way systematically through the marked area. The timber was incredible, some of the finest old growth I'd ever seen. These trees had been growing since before Columbus landed in America, and we were cutting them down to be turned into deck furniture and house frames. It felt wrong, but the money was too good to walk away from. It was the skidder operator who first noticed something was off. He'd been running equipment for 15 years and knew the sounds of the forest as well as anyone. On the morning of our 8th day, he shut down his machine during the lunch break and walked over to where I was eating a sandwich on a stump. He looked nervous, which was unusual. He was normally the joker of the crew, always ready with a smart comment or a story about his weekend adventures. But that day, he seemed jumpy, constantly looking over his shoulder toward the tree line. He asked if I'd heard anything strange out there. I listened for a moment. The usual sounds were there, birds calling, the distant rumble of machinery working about a quarter mile away, the wind moving through the canopy above us. Nothing seemed out of place. He shook his head and took a bite of his ham sandwich. He said he thought he had heard something following him that morning when he was dragging logs out, like footsteps, but too heavy to be a person. I laughed and told him it was probably a bear. The area was known for having a healthy black bear population, and they were getting ready for winter hibernation. A hungry bear following the scent of our food wouldn't be unusual, but he shook his head again. He said he knew what a bear sounded like, and this was different. 2 legs, not 4, and bigger. The next day, our best climber came down from topping a massive redwood with a story that was eerily similar. He'd been about 60 feet up, working his way around the trunk with his chainsaw when he heard something moving through the trees below him. When he looked down, he saw what he thought was a person walking between the trees, but the proportions were all wrong. He said it was too tall, maybe 8 feet, maybe taller, and it was covered in dark hair or fur, moved like a person, though, not like any animal he'd ever seen. The reaction from the crew was predictable. Most of the guys laughed and started making jokes about our climber spending too much time in the thin air at the top of the trees. One of the younger guys started doing an exaggerated impression of a caveman, beating his chest and making grunting sounds. Even I chuckled, though something about the climber's expression made me think he wasn't joking around. He insisted he was telling us what he saw and we could take it or leave it. The old man who'd been listening from his folding chair near the fire finally spoke up. He said there were all kinds of wildlife in these woods. Could have been anything. Maybe a hunter in a ghillie suit, maybe just shadows playing tricks on his eyes. Point was, we had a job to do, and we were getting paid good money to do it. We needed to keep our focus on the work. That seemed to settle things, but I noticed our climber didn't join in the laughter and jokes for the rest of the evening. He just sat there staring into the fire, occasionally glancing toward the dark wall of trees that surrounded our camp. Over the next few days, more of the crew started reporting strange sightings. One of the chainsaw operators claimed he saw something watching him from the ridge above our work area, a dark shape that disappeared when he tried to get a better look. Another guy found what he swore were footprints near the maintenance shed, though they were smudged and unclear in the soft soil. Most disturbing was what our main equipment operator found on Friday morning of our second week. He'd gone out early to do a pre-start inspection on his feller buncher and discovered that someone had been messing with the machine during the night. The operator's cab door was hanging open, even though he was certain he'd latched it securely the night before. More concerning was the condition of the door itself. It looked like it had been yanked open with tremendous force, bending the metal hinges and cracking the safety glass in the door window. The old man examined the damage with a puzzled expression. The door mechanism wasn't broken in a way that suggested mechanical failure. It looked like something had grabbed the handle and pulled with enough force to overcome the safety locks and bend solid steel. The old man suggested maybe someone was trying to mess with our operation, some environmental group trying to sabotage the equipment. But if it was sabotage, it was unlike anything we'd ever seen. There was no graffiti, no obvious damage to the critical systems, nothing that would actually stop us from working. Just that door, hanging at an unnatural angle like a giant, had tried to climb into the cab. Our equipment operator was spooked enough that he started parking his machine closer to the trailers at night, and he began carrying a baseball bat with him when he had to work alone in the more remote sections of our area. The mood in the camp was changing from skeptical amusement to genuine unease. The breaking point came during our third week, on a Tuesday that started like any other. I was running the loader, moving cut logs from the staging area to the trucks that would haul them out to the main road. It was monotonous work that let my mind wander, so I was only half paying attention to my surroundings. I was positioning a particularly large redwood log when I heard the skidder engine shut down abruptly. That wasn't unusual. The operator often stopped to adjust his load or clear debris from his path. But when the silence stretched on for several minutes, I started to get concerned. I shut down my own machine and climbed out of the cab, calling his name. No response. His skidder was visible through the trees about 200 yards away, sitting motionless with its blade lowered. I could see the drag marks where he'd been pulling logs, but no sign of the operator himself. I started walking toward his machine, calling his name every few steps. The forest seemed unusually quiet. No bird songs, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth. Even the wind had died down to an eerie stillness, I found the operator about 50 feet from his skidder, standing perfectly still behind a cluster of young fir trees. His back was to me, and he was staring deeper into the forest. When I got close enough to touch his shoulder, he jumped like he'd been electrocuted. He spun around with wild eyes, looking terrified. I asked him what he was doing, and he pointed toward a section of forest where the trees grew thick enough to create deep shadows even in the middle of the day. He whispered that there was something in there. He'd been watching it for 10 minutes. It was just standing there, like it was watching him back. I looked where he was pointing, but couldn't see anything except trees and shadows. I asked what kind of something. He said it was big, really big, and it was standing on 2 legs. I stared harder into the shadows, trying to make out any shape that didn't belong. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A darker patch among the trees that seemed too vertical, too regular to be natural. But when I blinked and looked again, it was gone. I suggested maybe it was just a trick of the light, though I kept my voice low. The operator shook his head emphatically. He insisted he knew what he saw. That thing was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, and it was definitely watching him. When he shut down the skidder, it tilted its head like it was listening. We stood there for another few minutes, both of us scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Whatever the operator had seen was either gone or hiding too well for us to spot. Finally, we decided to head back to our machines and continue working, but I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder for the rest of the day. That night at dinner, the skidder operator told the rest of the crew about his sighting. The reaction was mixed. Some guys laughed it off, others listened with growing concern. Our climber nodded knowingly, saying it sounded like the same thing he'd seen from up in the trees. The old man tried to maintain order and focus on the job, but even he was starting to look worried. We were making good progress on the logging operation, but the strange incidents were affecting morale and productivity. Men were working in pairs now instead of alone, and everyone was constantly looking over their shoulders. The next morning brought our first real evidence that something unusual was happening. One of the guys, who was always the first one up, usually started the coffee in the mess hall, came running to the foreman's trailer at dawn with panic in his voice. He said we needed to see something. He was still in his underwear and boots. We all followed him to the mess hall trailer, and what we found there made even the skeptics among us start taking the situation seriously. The heavy wooden door, which we always kept locked at night, was hanging open. But it wasn't just unlocked. The entire doorframe was split and splintered, like something had forced its way in with tremendous strength. Inside the trailer, the scene was even more disturbing. Our food storage area had been ransacked, but not in a way that suggested human intruders. Canned goods were scattered across the floor, many of them dented and punctured by what looked like massive fingers or claws. A 50-pound bag of rice had been torn open, and its contents scattered everywhere. Most unnervingly, there were wet marks on the floor and walls that looked like drool or saliva. But it was the handprints that really got our attention. On the metal surface of our industrial refrigerator, clear as day, were 2 hand-shaped impressions pressed into the steel. They were enormous, easily twice the size of any of our hands. And the force required to leave such deep impressions in solid metal was hard to comprehend. The old man studied the handprints for a long time, occasionally placing his own hand next to them for comparison. The difference in size was dramatic. Whatever had left those prints had fingers that were longer and thicker than any human hand, with what appeared to be sharp nails or claws at the tips. The old man suggested it could have been a bear. They were strong enough to bend metal, and they could manipulate their paws almost like hands. Our climber shook his head. He pointed out that those weren't paw prints. The thumb placement showed it was an opposable thumb, just like a human's, but bigger. We spent the morning cleaning up the mess hall and reinforcing the door, but the damage was done to our peace of mind. Whatever was out there in the forest had come right into our camp, into the place where we slept and ate. It had demonstrated strength that was almost superhuman, and intelligence enough to open food containers. The mood in the camp that day was tense and fearful. Men were jumping at shadows, and productivity dropped as everyone spent more time watching the tree line than focusing on their work. The old man called a meeting that evening to address the situation. He acknowledged that everyone was spooked by what had happened, but we had a job to finish and we were professionals. Whatever had been messing with our camp, we were going to take precautions. From now on, we would work in teams of 3 minimum. Nobody went anywhere alone, especially after dark. We'd set up a watch rotation to keep an eye on the camp at night. He paused and looked around at all of us. He said if anyone wanted to leave, he wouldn't blame them, but we should remember we were getting paid double rate for this job, and we were almost halfway done. 6 more weeks, and we'd all have enough money to take a nice long vacation. Nobody left that night, but I could see the doubt in several faces. We were all tough men who'd worked in dangerous conditions before, but this was something none of us had experience with. Bears and mountain lions were dangerous but predictable. This was something else entirely. The watch rotation started that night, with 2 men staying awake in 2-hour shifts to patrol the camp perimeter. I drew the midnight to 2 a.m. shift with our main equipment operator, and we spent those 2 hours walking around the trailers with powerful flashlights, checking locks, and listening for any unusual sounds. The forest at night was alive with normal sounds. Owls calling, small animals moving through the undergrowth, the occasional crack of a tree settling. But there were other sounds too, ones that made us both stop and listen carefully. Distant, crashing sounds like something large moving quickly through heavy brush. Occasional calls that didn't match any animal either of us recognized. Low, guttural sounds that seemed almost like attempted speech. Around 1:30 a.m., we heard something that made both of us freeze in place. From somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp came a sound like wood splintering, but not the sharp crack of a branch breaking. This was a prolonged groaning and splitting sound, like a large tree being slowly torn apart. Our equipment operator whispered, asking what the hell that was, swinging his flashlight toward the sound. The beam of light penetrated maybe 50 feet into the forest before being swallowed by the darkness between the trees. We stood there listening for several minutes, but the sound didn't repeat. Whatever had caused it was either gone or staying very still. When our shift ended at 2 a.m., we woke the next 2 guys for their watch. I told them about the splintering sound, and one of them just nodded grimly. He said the previous shift had heard something similar the night before, like something out there was ripping trees apart for fun. I went back to my bunk in one of the sleeping trailers, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound, the trailer settling, wind in the trees, one of the other men shifting in his sleep, seemed amplified and threatening. When I finally did doze off, I had vivid nightmares about massive hands reaching through the trailer walls and enormous shadows moving between the trees. The next morning brought fresh evidence of our nighttime visitor. The watch team found a Douglas fir about 100 yards from camp that looked like it had been attacked by a tornado. The tree was probably 80 feet tall and at least 2 feet in diameter, but it was snapped off about 20 feet from the base. The break wasn't clean like it would be from wind damage. The wood was splintered and shredded with long gouges that looked like claw marks. More disturbing were the smaller trees around it. Several young firs had been bent over and twisted into unnatural shapes, their trunks kinked but not broken. It was like something had grabbed them and deliberately bent them into knots just because it could. The old man examined the damage with a measuring tape and a camera, documenting everything carefully. He admitted he'd never seen anything like this. The tree was healthy, no rot, no structural weakness. Whatever broke it had to apply massive force, probably several tons of pressure. Our climber pointed out scratches in the bark of nearby trees, long parallel gouges that started about 8 feet off the ground and went up another 3 or 4 feet. He said those looked like claw marks, but wondered what kind of animal was tall enough to make marks that high. By our 4th week, the entire crew was on edge. The strange incidents were happening almost daily now. Sounds in the night, evidence of something large moving through our work area, occasional glimpses of massive shapes in the distance. Productivity had dropped significantly as men spent more time looking over their shoulders than operating their equipment. The thing that bothered me most was the feeling of being watched. It started as just an occasional sensation, that prickly feeling you get when someone's staring at you. But as the days went on, it became constant. Every time I climbed into the cab of my loader, every time I got out to check a load or adjust the rigging, I felt eyes on me. It wasn't just me. The whole crew was experiencing the same thing. The skidder operator started wearing sunglasses even on cloudy days because he said the feeling of being watched was so intense it was giving him headaches. Our climber refused to climb trees alone anymore, saying he felt like something was stalking him from the ground while he worked. Our main equipment operator had the most disturbing experience. He was operating his feller buncher in a section of forest about half a mile from camp when he noticed something moving parallel to him through the trees. At first, he thought it was one of the other crew members, but when he stopped his machine and called out, there was no response. The movement continued, staying just far enough away that he couldn't get a clear look at whatever it was. But he could tell it was large and bipedal, walking upright through the forest with surprising grace for something so big it seemed to be pacing him, stopping when he stopped, moving when he moved. After about 20 minutes of this, our equipment operator had had enough. He shut down his machine and climbed out with his baseball bat, determined to confront whatever was following him. The moment he stepped out of the cab, the movement in the trees stopped. He shouted into the forest, demanding to know what was out there and what it wanted. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from somewhere in the trees about 50 yards away, came a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a call, deep, resonant, and unmistakably vocal. But it wasn't human. It was too low, too powerful, like the sound a gorilla might make if it was the size of a grizzly bear. The call was answered from another direction, then another. He realized he was surrounded by at least 3 of whatever these things were, and they were communicating with each other. He dropped the baseball bat and ran back to his machine, starting it up, driving back toward camp as fast as the big feller buncher could move. When our equipment operator told us about his experience that evening, nobody laughed. The joking and skepticism had ended days ago. Now we were all believers and we were all scared. It was our climber who found their camp. He'd been working on topping trees in a section of old growth about a mile from our operation when he smelled something unusual. A musky animal scent that was stronger than anything he'd encountered in 20 years of outdoor work. Following the scent, he discovered what could only be described as a primitive settlement hidden in a grove of ancient redwoods. There were no buildings in the conventional sense, but the trees had been modified in ways that created shelter and living spaces. Branches had been woven together to form walls and roofs, creating structures that blended seamlessly with the natural forest. The area showed clear signs of habitation. There were fire rings made from arranged stones, though the ashes looked old and cold. Food caches were built into hollows in the tree trunks, containing what looked like nuts, berries, and dried meat. Most unsettling were the sleeping areas. Depressions in the ground lined with moss and leaves, each one large enough for something much bigger than a human. Our climber counted at least 8 of these sleeping areas, suggesting a family group or small community. He also found tools, Not manufactured items, but carefully shaped pieces of wood and stone that showed intelligence and purpose. There were digging sticks, scrapers made from sharp stones, and what looked like primitive spears with fire-hardened points. But the most disturbing discovery was the collection of human artifacts scattered throughout the camp. There were pieces of clothing, work shirts, boots, and baseball caps that looked like they'd been torn from their owners. License plates from cars and trucks, some dating back decades. And most chilling of all, personal items like wallets, watches, and wedding rings arranged in what seemed like a deliberate display. Our climber didn't stay long. The intelligence behind the camp's construction and the implications of those human artifacts were too frightening to contemplate alone. He marked the location carefully and hiked back to our operation as quickly as he could. When he told the old man about his discovery, our foreman's face went pale. The old man had been in the logging business long enough to have heard stories about missing hikers and campers in remote forest areas. The collection of human belongings suggested that whatever was living in that camp had been encountering people for many years. The old man said we needed to call this in. This was beyond anything we could handle. But when he tried to reach the company's regional office on the satellite phone, he was told that his supervisor was unavailable and that all decisions about the operation had to go through corporate headquarters. It would be at least 48 hours before anyone could get back to him. In the meantime, we were told to continue working and avoid the area where our climber had found the camp. But knowing it was there, knowing that we were sharing this forest with intelligent creatures that collected human belongings as trophies, made it almost impossible to focus on our jobs. The attack came during our 5th week on a Thursday morning that had started like any other. I was operating my loader in a section of the forest that we'd been working for 3 days, moving cut logs to the staging area where the trucks could pick them up. The work was routine and mindless, which is probably why I didn't notice the change in the forest sounds until it was too late. The first sign something was wrong was the silence. The normal background noise of the forest, birds singing, small animals moving through the undergrowth, the distant sound of chainsaws and equipment had all stopped. The only sounds were the rumble of my loader's engine and the hydraulic whine of the lifting arms. I was positioning a massive redwood log when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Something large was moving through the trees to my left, keeping pace with my machine but staying just out of clear sight. At first I thought it might be one of the crew, but the movement was wrong. Too fluid, too quick for a person carrying equipment. I stopped the loader and shut down the engine, climbing out of the cab to get a better look. The forest was eerily quiet, with not even the sound of wind in the trees. I could hear my own heartbeat and the creak of cooling metal from my machine, but nothing else. I called out, asking if someone was there. The response was immediate and terrifying. From the trees came a sound that was part roar, part scream, and completely inhuman. It was followed by the crash of something large moving rapidly through the forest, not trying to hide anymore. I caught my first clear glimpse of our tormentor as it emerged from behind a cluster of young firs about 50 yards away. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall and probably closer to 9. Its body was covered in dark brown hair that was longer and shaggier than any bear's fur, but the proportions were all wrong for a bear. This thing stood fully upright on 2 legs, with arms that hung down past its knees, and a distinctly human-like posture. The face was the most unsettling part. It was clearly humanoid but primitive, with a heavy brow ridge, a flat nose, and a mouth full of large teeth. The eyes were dark and intelligent, focused on me with what looked like deliberate intent. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the clearing. I was frozen with a mixture of fear and fascination, unable to move or speak. The creature was perfectly still too, watching me with those dark eyes, its massive chest rising and falling with controlled breathing. Then it roared again, a sound so loud and powerful that I felt it in my bones. The creature began moving toward me with surprising speed, covering the 50 yards between us in what seemed like seconds. I ran for my life. I made it about 20 feet before I heard the sound of metal being torn apart behind me. I glanced back to see the creature attacking my loader with its bare hands, grabbing the machine's bucket and twisting it until the hydraulic lines snapped and sprayed fluid everywhere. The thing was easily lifting and manipulating parts of the machine that weighed thousands of pounds. I kept running toward the sound of chainsaws, where I knew I'd find other members of the crew. Behind me, I could hear the destruction continuing. Metal grinding and tearing, the crash of heavy equipment being thrown around like toys. I found 2 of our chainsaw operators working together to fell a large Douglas fir about a quarter-mile away. They took one look at my face and shut down their saws immediately. I gasped that we needed to get everyone and get out of there right now. It was real and it was angry. Before I could explain further, we heard the roar echoing through the forest, closer now and seeming to come from multiple directions. Whatever had attacked my loader wasn't alone, and they were all heading our way. The 3 of us ran toward the staging area where most of the crew was working. We found our main equipment operator, the skidder operator, and 3 other guys loading logs onto a truck. When they saw us running and heard the sounds from the forest, they didn't need an explanation. The old man shouted from his position near the truck cab, telling everyone to get into the trucks and leave the equipment behind. But as we started toward the vehicles, creatures began emerging from the tree line around the entire clearing. I counted at least 6 of them, all similar in size and appearance to the one that had destroyed my loader. They moved with coordinated purpose, like they were working together to surround us. The largest of the creatures, standing nearly 10 feet tall with graying hair around its face, stepped into the clearing and began walking directly toward our main equipment operator's feller buncher. The machine was still running, its engine idling while the operator prepared to shut it down for lunch. Instead of running, the creature approached the massive machine fearlessly. It studied the feller buncher for a moment, as if trying to understand how it worked. Then it grabbed the boom arm, a piece of machinery that weighed several tons, and began twisting it like it was made of plastic. The sound of metal failing under that incredible force was indescribable. Steel beams designed to lift multi-ton logs snapped like twigs. Hydraulic cylinders that operated under thousands of pounds of pressure were crushed and torn apart. In less than 2 minutes, the creature had turned a $250,000 piece of equipment into scrap metal. But it wasn't finished. The creature grabbed the rear of the feller buncher and began pushing it toward the slope that led down to our camp. The machine weighed over 40 tons, but the creature moved it like it was pushing a wheelbarrow. As the feller buncher tipped over the edge of the slope, it began to roll and tumble down the hill, gaining speed and destroying everything in its path. Trees that had stood for centuries were snapped off like matchsticks. The machine bounced and rolled for what seemed like forever, creating a path of destruction that looked like a tornado had touched down. The creature watched its handiwork with what looked like satisfaction, then turned its attention back to us. But instead of attacking, it simply stared at us with those dark, intelligent eyes. The message was clear. This was their forest, and we were not welcome. We didn't need to be told twice. The entire crew piled into the 2 trucks that were still operational, leaving behind thousands of dollars worth of equipment and personal belongings. The old man got behind the wheel of the lead truck while our main equipment operator drove the second one, and we tore down that mountain road like the devil himself was chasing us. Nobody spoke during the drive out. We were all too shaken by what we'd witnessed, too busy trying to process the fact that we just encountered creatures that shouldn't exist. The silence was broken only by the radio crackle as the old man tried to reach the company's emergency line to report what had happened. When we finally got through to someone in authority, the old man's explanation was met with skepticism and demands for clarification. How could a piece of equipment worth $250,000 just be destroyed by an animal? What kind of animal could push a 40-ton machine down a hillside? The old man stuck to the facts as he knew them, but I could hear the doubt in the voices on the other end of the radio. They were thinking insurance fraud, equipment failure, maybe a cover-up for some kind of accident. The truth, that we'd been attacked by a family of creatures that looked like something out of prehistoric times, was too incredible for anyone to believe. We drove straight through to the company's regional headquarters in Eureka, arriving in the late afternoon, still covered in dirt and hydraulic fluid from our hasty escape. The parking lot was full of company vehicles and unfamiliar cars with government license plates. Word of our incident had apparently traveled fast through the corporate hierarchy. What followed were 3 days of the most intensive questioning I've ever experienced. We were separated and interviewed individually by teams of company officials, insurance investigators, and people who claimed to be from various government agencies but never showed us any identification. The questions were relentless and repetitive. What exactly did we see? How many creatures were there? Did we take any photographs or video? Did we collect any physical evidence? Had any of us been drinking or using drugs? Were we sure we hadn't simply encountered a group of people in costumes? Each of us stuck to our story, describing what we'd witnessed as accurately as possible. But with each retelling, I could see the skepticism growing in our interrogators' faces. They were looking for inconsistencies, for signs that we were lying or delusional or covering up some kind of negligence that had led to the destruction of expensive equipment. The turning point came when our climber told them about finding the creature's camp and the collection of human artifacts. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The company officials suddenly became very interested in the exact location of the camp, demanding detailed maps and GPS coordinates. More importantly, the questions changed. Instead of asking whether we'd really seen what we claimed to see, they started asking about who else we'd told and whether we'd spoken to any media outlets or researchers. They wanted to know if we'd posted anything on the internet or discussed our experience with friends or family members. It was becoming clear that they believed us and that they were very concerned about our story becoming public. On the third day, we were brought together for what they called a resolution meeting. The room was full of lawyers and company executives, plus a few people in suits who still wouldn't identify themselves beyond vague references to federal interests in forest management. The lead attorney, a sharp-dressed woman with ice-cold eyes, laid out our situation in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. The forest area where we'd been working was part of a classified research project involving rare and endangered species. Our logging operation had been a cover story to explain the presence of equipment and personnel in the area. What we'd encountered were not unknown creatures, but rather a relocated population of a rare primate species that was being studied and protected under federal law. The details of the project were classified for national security reasons, and any public disclosure of information about the creatures would violate multiple federal statutes. She went on to explain that the company would compensate us generously for the loss of our equipment and the traumatic nature of our experience. Each member of the crew would receive a payment equal to a full year's salary, plus medical coverage for any stress-related health issues that might arise from the incident. In exchange, we would sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements that would legally bind us to silence about everything we'd experienced. Violation of the agreement would result in immediate legal action, criminal prosecution, and financial penalties that would bankrupt any of us. But there was more. After the formal meeting ended, each of us was taken aside for a private conversation with one of the unnamed government officials. The man who spoke to me was soft-spoken and polite, but his message was anything but gentle. He explained that there were interests involved in the situation that went far beyond simple corporate liability or scientific research. The existence of large intelligent primates in North American forests was a matter of national security, with implications for land use, resource management, and public safety that I couldn't possibly understand. People who talk publicly about encounters with these creatures often found their lives becoming very difficult in ways that couldn't be directly traced back to their disclosures. They lost jobs, had trouble getting credit, faced tax audits and regulatory investigations, and sometimes experienced more serious problems that appeared to be random bad luck. He suggested that the smartest thing any of us could do was take the money, sign the papers, and forget that any of this had ever happened. He assured me that this was not a threat, just a realistic assessment of how things worked when certain sensitive subjects were involved. The message was crystal clear: keep quiet or face consequences that would make our encounter with the creatures seem like a pleasant memory. We all signed the papers. What choice did we have? The money was real, more than any of us had ever seen at one time. The legal threats were real too, backed by resources and authority that we couldn't hope to challenge. And underlying it all was the implicit understanding that these people had ways of making problems disappear that went far beyond lawyers and courtrooms. The crew scattered after that. Some of the guys used the money to retire early or start new businesses in different states. Others went back to logging, but never talked about what had happened in those California woods. A few seemed to develop drinking problems that hadn't existed before our encounter. As for me, I took my money and bought a small farm in Oregon, far from any old-growth forests. I told my wife that I'd gotten lucky with some investments and decided to change careers. She never questioned the story, probably because she could see how much I needed to put my logging days behind me. For about 10 years, I thought that was the end of it. I followed the news occasionally, looking for any reports of similar encounters or unexplained incidents in remote forest areas. There were always stories, hikers who disappeared without a trace, campers who reported being stalked by unknown creatures, occasional blurry photographs that showed large, hairy figures in the woods. But these stories never seemed to gain much traction in the mainstream media. They were relegated to tabloids and internet forums, dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. The few researchers who tried to investigate seriously seemed to face constant obstacles. Funding problems, equipment failures, legal challenges, and personal troubles that forced them to abandon their work. I began to understand that what we'd experienced was part of something much larger and more organized than I'd initially realized. There was a deliberate effort to suppress information about these creatures, involving resources and coordination that suggested government involvement at the highest levels. Over the years, I've pieced together a picture of how the cover-up works. It's not a single conspiracy involving massive numbers of people, but rather a loose network of interests that all benefit from keeping the truth hidden. The logging and timber companies don't want their operations shut down because of endangered species protections. The government doesn't want panic about dangerous creatures roaming public lands. The scientific establishment doesn't want to deal with evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about human evolution and North American wildlife. So when incidents occur, they're handled quietly and efficiently. Witnesses are paid off or discredited, evidence disappears or is explained away. The few stories that do make it to the public are mixed in with so many hoaxes and fabrications that the real accounts become impossible to distinguish from the fake ones. The system is brilliant in its simplicity. You don't need to silence everyone or destroy all evidence. You just need to create enough doubt and confusion that no one knows what to believe. Add in the natural human tendency to dismiss things that don't fit our worldview, and most people will do the work of suppression themselves. I've followed the careers of several researchers who got too close to the truth over the years. A scientist who was studying primate populations in the Pacific Northwest had her funding pulled after she published a paper suggesting that unidentified primate species might exist in North American forests. Her research data was confiscated during a routine audit and has never been returned. A wildlife photographer who claimed to have captured clear footage of a Sasquatch family group died in a car accident just days before he was scheduled to present his evidence at a cryptozoology conference. His equipment and all his footage were stolen from the crash site before police arrived. These might be coincidences, but there have been too many similar incidents over the years for me to believe that. Someone or some organization is working very hard to keep this information from reaching the public. The hardest part about keeping this secret hasn't been the legal threats or the fear of consequences. It's been the isolation when you've seen something that fundamentally changes your understanding of the world, but you can't share that knowledge with anyone. It creates a kind of psychological burden that's hard to describe. I've wanted to tell my wife 1,000 times, especially during the early years when I would wake up screaming from nightmares about those dark, intelligent eyes staring at me from the forest. She knew something was wrong, knew that whatever had happened during my last logging job had changed me in ways I couldn't explain. But I kept quiet, partly because of the legal agreements I'd signed, but mostly because I was afraid of what might happen to her if she became involved. The people who had debriefed us made it clear that their reach extended to family members and close associates. Protecting her meant protecting my silence. The nightmares faded over time, but they never completely went away. Even now, 30 years later, I sometimes dream about that roar echoing through the forest and the sound of metal being torn apart by bare hands. I wake up with my heart pounding, remembering the feeling of being watched by something that was both more and less than human. I've also had to live with the knowledge that those creatures are still out there, still sharing the forests with hikers and campers who have no idea what they might encounter. Over the years, I've followed news reports of missing persons in remote areas, wondering how many of those disappearances might be connected to what we encountered. There was a case in 2003 that particularly haunted me. A family of 4 vanished while camping in the Olympic National Forest, leaving behind their tent and all their belongings. The official explanation was that they had gotten lost and died of exposure, but their bodies were never found despite massive search efforts. I couldn't help wondering if they had encountered something similar to what we'd faced. Had they stumbled into territory that was being defended by creatures that most people didn't even believe existed? The questions tormented me, but there was nothing I could do without breaking the silence I'd promised to maintain. Over the past decade, I've noticed changes in how remote forest areas are managed and monitored. There are more restrictions on access to certain wilderness areas, more surveillance equipment in places where you wouldn't expect to find it, and more coordination between various government agencies in managing public lands. Some of this might be explained by increased environmental awareness and homeland security concerns following 9/11. But I suspect there's another layer of activity that the public doesn't know about. Ongoing efforts to monitor and manage the populations we encountered. The creatures we saw were clearly intelligent and organized. They had developed tools, established settlements, and demonstrated the ability to coordinate group activities. A population of such beings would require careful management to prevent conflicts with human activities while protecting their continued existence. I imagine there are people whose full-time job is tracking these populations, managing their territory, and dealing with situations when they come into contact with humans. The logging operation we were part of might have been one method of testing their behavior and establishing boundaries. It would explain why we were paid so much for what should have been a routine job. and why the company had permits to log in supposedly protected areas. We weren't just cutting trees, we were unknowingly participating in some kind of research or management program. What finally convinced me to break my silence after all these years was a news story that appeared briefly on a regional website before being taken down. A construction crew working on a new highway project in Northern California reported being harassed by large, aggressive animals that damaged their equipment and forced them to abandon the work site. The location was less than 50 miles from where our encounter had taken place, in an area that was scheduled for development as part of a new residential community. The brief news report mentioned that work on the project had been indefinitely suspended due to environmental concerns, but gave no details about what those concerns might be. I recognized the pattern immediately. Another human activity encroaching on territory that was already occupied, another encounter with creatures that most people don't believe exist, another cover-up designed to minimize public awareness while the situation was managed privately. But this time, the stakes seemed higher. A residential development would bring hundreds of families into direct contact with these creatures on a permanent basis. The potential for conflict and casualties would be enormous, far beyond anything that could be managed quietly. I started to wonder if the secrecy that had been maintained for decades might finally be breaking down under the pressure of expanding human development and shrinking wilderness areas. Maybe the time had come for the truth to emerge, whether the authorities wanted it to or not. I'm telling the story now because I'm getting old and because I think people have a right to know what's sharing the forests with them. The legal agreements I signed are probably still binding, and I'm sure there will be consequences for breaking my silence. But I've decided that some things are more important than personal safety. Those creatures we encountered weren't monsters or demons. They were intelligent beings trying to survive in a world that was increasingly dominated by human activity. They had families, tools, and social structures. They demonstrated the ability to make decisions and coordinate their actions. In many ways, they seemed more human than the people who tried to cover up their existence. But they were also incredibly dangerous when threatened. The strength they demonstrated in destroying our equipment could easily have been turned against us. If we hadn't been able to escape when we did, I doubt any of us would have survived to tell this story. People who venture into remote wilderness areas deserve to know about this potential danger. They deserve to make informed decisions about the risks they're taking when they hike or camp in areas where these creatures might be present. More importantly, these beings deserve recognition and protection. If they're as intelligent as they appear to be, then they have rights that are being ignored by the conspiracy of silence that surrounds their existence. They're not just another wildlife species to be managed, they're potential neighbors in the truest sense of the word. I've had 30 years to think about the implications of what we encountered, and I've come to believe that the existence of these creatures represents one of the most significant discoveries in human history. They're living proof that our understanding of human evolution and the history of life on Earth is incomplete. If creatures this intelligent and physically capable have been living alongside humans for thousands of years without being officially acknowledged, what does that say about our assumptions regarding our place in the natural world? How many other discoveries are being suppressed because they don't fit into the accepted scientific paradigm? The cover-up represents more than just corporate interests or government secrecy. It's a fundamental denial of reality that prevents us from understanding our true relationship with the natural world. We're sharing this planet with other intelligent species, but we're pretending they don't exist because their presence complicates our narrative of human dominance. This willful ignorance is becoming increasingly dangerous as human activity expands into the last remaining wilderness areas. Climate change, deforestation, and urban development are all putting pressure on the territories where these creatures live. Eventually, conflicts will become inevitable. And when that happens, the secrecy that has been maintained for so long will become impossible to sustain. I don't expect everyone who reads this to believe me. After 30 years of cover-ups and disinformation, the truth has become almost indistinguishable from fiction. But for those who are willing to consider the possibility that our world is stranger and more complex than we've been told, I offer this account as evidence. The creatures are real. They're intelligent, powerful, and trying to survive in a world that refuses to acknowledge their existence. They're not the mythical monsters of campfire stories. They're flesh and blood beings with their own needs, fears, and social structures. They're also our responsibility. Whether we acknowledge them or not, our actions affect their lives and their future. The decisions we make about land use, development, and resource extraction will determine whether they continue to exist or join the long list of species that have been driven to extinction by human activity. I've kept the secret for 3 decades, but I can't take it to my grave. Whatever happens to me as a result of telling this story, I hope it contributes to a larger conversation about what we're really sharing this planet with. The truth has been hidden long enough. It's time for people to know what's really out there in the deep woods. The creatures we encountered in those California forests changed my understanding of the world in ways I'm still processing. They showed me that reality is far stranger and more complex than I'd ever imagined. They also showed me that there are forces at work in our society that are willing to go to extraordinary lengths to suppress information that challenges our assumptions about the natural world. I don't know what will happen when this story becomes public, but I know that the truth deserves to be told. People deserve to know what's really out there when they venture into the wilderness. And those magnificent, terrifying creatures deserve to be recognized for what they are. Not monsters or myths, but fellow inhabitants of a world that belongs to all of us. The forest remembers everything, even when we choose to forget. And somewhere in those deep woods of Northern California, in the shadows between the ancient trees, they're still watching and waiting for the day when we're finally ready to acknowledge their existence. For more interesting stories like this, consider checking this out.